Welcome to the Darkstream, Vox Day, voxday.blogspot.com. And I apologize for the delay. I was just verifying a certain someone on a certain site that shall remain nameless until tomorrow evening. So thanks for tuning in. Welcome to the Dread Ilk, to the VFM. Hello to all the bears. And even hello to all the scientists who might be following along after last night's debate. So I thought it was really good. I was very pleased with how it went. I was really interested to see what JF's response would be, what his approach would be. I thought it was really interesting and not at all incorrect for people to talk about how I was rhetorically trounced and so forth. See, this is what's interesting. County Rhythm says, I just finished watching the debate. It may be that I didn't understand the point Vox was trying to make, or he didn't get around to it, but it seemed that JF refutes Vox's objections. See, this is what's interesting. This is the importance of rhetoric. What you have to understand is that JF refuted literally nothing. He didn't even respond to what I was talking about. I'll explain that in a bit, but the fact of the matter is that the debate was almost entirely over everybody's heads. And to a certain extent, you can even say that it wasn't a debate in the actual dialectical sense because JF avoided the question. He steered very, very far around the question. In fact, it alarmed him to such a point that I'll try to sit up a bit here. I'll try to, this is funny. Tubercat says, I didn't understand anything that was going on. No, I disagree that JF didn't understand. I think he did understand, and he very, very much didn't want to get into the actual issues. And I can show you exactly what we're talking about in this regard. I'll show you a couple things. And so what we're talking about here is, and what we actually saw there was the usual biologist's retreat to imagination and numbers that they don't understand. People have said, "Oh, well, are you gonna do a debate again later?" No, there's no point. That's what's so interesting about what I'm working on here, is that there's not going to be anything to debate. In fact, what we saw last night is that there isn't any point in debating this stuff because they desperately don't want to talk about it. And so we'll get to that point in a little bit here. I was just bringing this in. I'll load that up later. There's a question here. All JF said was, yeah, mass parallel propagation deals with the issues you brought up, no worries. But he never gave adequate justification for that. Well, there's a very good reason for it. There's an excellent reason for it. There's a reason for it that you can't possibly quibble with. And let me read this to you. So this is what JF said about my approach. He said, the fact that you start with fixed mutation is a bad way to go with it. Really, the fixation problem is a separate problem in evolution. Because what he wants to talk about is mutation rates. He doesn't want to talk about fixed mutations. He wants to talk about mutation rates. He says, the model you built is almost there, but you cannot use fixed mutations. It is a fallacy to believe every mutation must be fixed. Of course, every mutation must not be fixed. Every newborn that is born with an estimated 70 mutations. Almost all of those mutations will go unfixed. And then towards the end, when he showed that chart, which I'm going to show you here, he said this little axiom I've been trying to talk to you about since the beginning, which is the difference between a fixed mutation rate and a mutation rate, which is what most scientists who ask these questions will work with. It will multiply your numbers by millions and billions. Well, no, it won't. In fact, the interesting thing is that, and I have to admit, I didn't bother to point it out because I was, to a certain extent, not interested in getting into the rhetorical game. And if somebody doesn't understand something like this, we would have gotten sidetracked onto an argument that didn't actually matter. But JF didn't understand that rate that I talked about actually represented the parallel propagation of those mutations that had been fixed. So we were already dealing within his context from the very beginning, and he didn't understand that. Now, in fairness, the way that I described it, I don't know if it would have been obvious to anyone, even to a biologist like himself. But, if you look at the study and you actually look at the graphic in the study, you can see that the mutations that were fixed happened to a certain extent in parallel. They didn't happen in series, and the 1600 was an average. And again, we're not talking about every single mutation needing to be fixed before the next one can come along. Okay, that is the very crude and simplistic way of looking at it. We're just talking about the averages. And so, and if you missed the debate, you can watch it. It's on the public space. Just it's on his channel, and so what you need to keep in mind, what you need to understand, is that different people have different reasons for debate, and I pointed this out that it wasn't my idea to jump in there and try to make myself look smarter or more knowledgeable about biology or genetics than JF. I don't. He knows more about genetics in his little finger than I do. But that's not relevant. That has literally nothing to do with what we're talking about. And so but I did think it was interesting that literally everybody missed the fact that parallelism and parallel propagation was built into that average. It doesn't matter. And let me explain what we're talking about here. Now, it's true that even mutations that are beneficial, or even mutations that propagate significantly, don't necessarily get fixed. For example, somebody look up quickly while we're talking. Somebody look up how long it has been since the mutation that causes white skin is believed to have come about. I don't recall correctly, but if I recall, it's something like on the order of, 12,000 years? Okay. Now, that mutation has not been fixed. That mutation has not been fixed because there are still a lot of people who don't have white skin. Ganji Bob Flankus asks, I would be most interested in chromosomal changes. They have to be fixed and are clear markers of speciation. That's a good point, and that's something that we should look into later. Anaf Habib says, that was a red herring by JF. All he did by appealing to mutation rates was to push the ball back a step. The main problem that a dysteleological process like TENS can generate order which is scientifically verifiable remains. That's exactly. No, just you guys don't guess. Around 8,000 years, 1 million years. There's a study that's fairly recent. It was published in the last 2-3 years. You should be able to find it without any trouble. They propose that the variant. I thought it was much more recent. And anyhow, the point is that, what we're talking about. Fozzie Bear says fixed means that the gene is a universal part of what it means to be part of the species. That's correct. And so, okay, Ethan Werner says 6 to 12,000 years. Cuck articles say 8,000. Okay, so let's use 8,000, right? That means in 8,000 years, and with the human generations being officially declared to be 20 years, that means 400 generations, right? So 400 generations have been insufficient to fix that white skin gene in the human species. Got it? 400 years is not enough to fix that particular gene. Why does this matter? You know, it's very simple because it's very simple because in order to get to the point where we talk about the different species, then every single member of that species has to have that gene. See, here's where you know people are stupid. The Secret said, JF steamrolled you yesterday. The look on your face when you realized your premise was faulty. My premise isn't faulty. JF doesn't know what he's talking about. He literally doesn't know. If he doesn't know what he's talking, if he does know what he's talking about, he was lying to you. He was trying to say that the mutation rates matter. That because there's so many mutations, it doesn't matter how they propagate through the population. And that's totally false. I mean, that's look at the map that the image that he showed. I'm going to show that to you now. Okay. Now read what it says at the top. It's effective genome size, indel events per site per generation, base substitution, mutation rate per generation, measurements for population mutation rate, and estimated effective population size for 7 prokaryotic and 8 eukaryotic organisms. That has nothing whatsoever to do with how fast one gene propagates through the entire species. Now, I understand that there's a lot of different genes within the species. Obviously, you know, I have the white skin gene, even though I'm an American Indian, and someone who is a black African doesn't have that gene, and yet we are the same species. We are both Homo sapiens sapiens. So in that sense, the white gene, the white skin gene, does not define our humanity. So it's not relevant to this discussion. But there are a number of genes that separate us from a chimpanzee, that separate us from a duck, that separate us from a fish. And all of those necessary genes, well, we need I'm sure that scientists have some word to describe it, but let's call it a species necessary gene or species unique gene. They all have to have it. And so those particular genes have to have propagated through the entire population and also not propagated through the populations of all these species that don't have it. 1950 Archangel says species defining gene. What I mean by that is a gene that every member of that species has to have. All right? Some genes, we all have different genes, but there are certain genes that we all have to have. Otherwise, we're not the same species. We're not all human. Now, JF did allude to this when he tried to say, well, we all have different genes, and some people are closer to chimpanzees, and there's a spectrum and all this sort of thing. That's not entirely true. There's no spectrum that goes all the way from Homo sapiens sapiens to pantroglodytes. But here's the most interesting thing is that, and at the most basic level, ask yourself this question. Why did JF have to retreat to rhetoric? Why would he retreat to rhetoric? And the answer is very simple. And it's right here in this study from the Journal of the Royal Society. It's a paper from 2008 called The Fixation Probability of Beneficial Mutations. Now remember, JF was saying, well, that's not what most scientists talk about. They don't talk about the fixation rate. They talk about the mutation rate, right? Well, the reason they talk about the mutation rate and they don't talk about the fixation rate is very simple. The fixation probability, the probability that the frequency of a particular allele in a population will ultimately reach unity, is one of the cornerstones of population genetics. Got that? It's one of the cornerstones of population genetics. JF was waving his hand and claiming it didn't matter. In fact, what did he actually say? He actually said, the fact that you start with fixed mutation is a bad way to go about it. Really, the fixation problem is a separate problem in evolution, which means he didn't want to talk about the problem I was talking about. And so so he was saying that it didn't matter, it was irrelevant, and yet the Royal Society says it's one of the cornerstones of population genetics. So who do you believe? Secondly, it talks about our aim. So they said, we give a brief historical overview of the mathematical approaches used to estimate the fixation probability of beneficial alleles. They've been working on this stuff since 1926. We then focus on some of the more recent work that has relaxed some of the key assumptions in the early papers. We address the possibility of future work, and they're excited about the new technologies. And our aim is to highlight the concrete testable predictions that have arisen from the theoretical literature. To date, however, the fixation probability of a specific beneficial mutation has never been experimentally measured. Got it? The fixation probability of a specific beneficial mutation has never been experimentally measured. Everything that JF was doing yesterday was a dodge. Everything he did yesterday was a retreat because he had no ability whatsoever to address the issue other than to wave his hands and claim that very large numbers meant that it was necessarily was a sufficient response. But it's not. In fact, I pointed this out on the blog today. Some of you have probably not noticed this. And so what I pointed out, and to make it more simply, if you look at the 9 million years, which is the current best estimate since the chimp-human last common ancestor, that means that there have been, with 20 years per generation, and the average, again, which included parallel propagation, of 1,600 generations per fixed mutation. And keep in mind, we already know that 400 generations was not enough to fix the white skin mutation in all humans. So that means that it takes 32,000 years per fixed mutation and a maximum number of fixed mutations of 125 over that period of time. Now, it might be easier to understand it this way, and that's how I think. That's what made sense to me, but it seemed to escape a lot of people. So to put it in more simple terms, there have been 450,000 chimpanzee and human generations since the last common ancestor. So 450,000 pointing towards chimp, 450,000 pointing towards human. Based on the number of mutations observed fixing in parallel in the nature study, that would permit a grand total of 562 total fixed mutations. However, the number of mutations that separate the two species, in other words, the number of mutations that chimps have that humans don't, human have that chimps don't, they're 29,999,438 short of the total. Okay? Think about it. 400 generations were not enough to fix one skin mutation. They've only got 10 times that total to separate humanity from chimpanzee. Are you falling for that? Do you really think it's credible? It doesn't matter that there are 70 mutations in every newborn. It doesn't matter. And so I find it very, very interesting. I find it very intriguing that an intelligent biologist had to retreat to hand waving, to a little computer program that doesn't actually do anything meaningful. I mean, the funniest thing about it all is that he didn't even realize that his little program was making my point for me. He was saying, well, this is something that we believe to have taken 1 billion years, but I've proved through this mathematical simulation that it could have taken 35 million years. So how would appealing to a simulation, saying that something could theoretically happen faster than it did, have anything to do with the case that I was making whatsoever? Because my case is based on the fastest possible propagation through the species. And that includes parallelism. And remember that as of 2008, the fixation probability of a specific beneficial mutation has never been experimentally measured. the mutations that existed in the 25 mutations that were found in the 40,000 generations that were observed were not necessarily beneficial. All they know is that they existed. They considered them to be neutral and not necessarily related to selection, but they had managed to fix in the populations. And Jack Roper also points out that at the speed that is required in order to fit within the timeframes given, we would be able to see evidence occurring in our lifetimes, necessarily. We should be able to see it in mammals. 4.3 years per generation. How many generations do you need? Well, if you're going to fit what we've been told is the growing of the tree of life, it has to be happening fast enough for us to be seeing some of this happen. And so it's interesting to see. I mean, I find it really intriguing how many of you thought that I was being blown out of the water by somebody who was not understanding that his objection was already built into my model, and was not understanding or was not bothering to listen to the fact that I was giving the absolute maximum benefit to the evolutionary case. I do not believe for a second that there is any population that has a single gene propagate through the entire species within 15.7 years or 15.7 generations. That's the absolute maximum possible. And that was based on a mathematical model that I had drawn up by a mathematician friend of mine who was using the maximum possible selection advantage. You know, basically saying that this gene is so powerful that it gives the fastest ever observed selection bonus to any individual with that gene. And so think about it. At 15.7 generations with a mammal, 4.3 years for a mammal generation, 15.7 generations. That means we should see new genes fixating in mammal populations every 67 years. Has that ever been observed? 1233 Watch King says he was ignoring you, pretending you were saying something else. Perhaps. See, this is what's kind of funny. You still have these people. Look, Dubson says, Creatio tard vox de BTFO'd by facts and logic. No, the facts, the logic was incorrect, and the facts were irrelevant. That didn't blow away anything that I said. 1950 Archangel said, I thought he wasn't making sense. I struggled to follow you as well as I could, but he wasn't rebutting or answering your points. Drew M. said, we would have known this had you stated it explicitly in response to JF's arguments. Well, yes, I could have stopped and explained everything, but do you really think that I would have been given the opportunity to do that on his channel while he was already actively engaged, not merely in avoiding what I was saying, but he had already set up his rhetorical showmanship with the whole little program ahead of time? I mean, Cam T is correct. My impression is that he was working to fool his own audience. I think so too. You know, That's why I'm not interested in when people were talking about a further debate. What's the point? You know, he already told me everything that I needed to know. You know, what I wanted to do, what I was hoping to accomplish, and what I did accomplish was to find out where the problems with the model were. You know, was I completely off base? Had I missed something so completely that it was irrelevant? And the answer was no. The one weak point, the one point that remains inconclusive at the moment, is the speed at which parallel propagation gives more time. Because based on serial propagation, evolution is completely disproved. And we're not just talking about by natural selection, we're talking about everything. If the genes have to fix in succession, then it's not possible. Now, on the parallel side, I personally am very, very skeptical that it's possible for them to propagate that quickly in parallel and still cover a sufficient portion of the population to fixate over time. Fixation, here's the thing you need to understand. Fixation is absolutely necessary. It's part of what defines the species. Most genes are not necessary. They don't necessarily need to be fixed. But some do. And those need enough time to propagate through the entire species. Id Prism says, I thought that he said the genes would potentially fix in batches. That's what we're talking about with developing in parallel. Bradley Vincent says, your points are relevant, but they don't categorically disprove evolution, in my opinion. Not yet, but the end is in sight. Ben Darling said, Vox, you said on the blog that this debate was your preparation for bigger things. What did you mean? I mean that I needed to test the basic assumptions. I needed to test the basic ideas and make sure that I was on the right track. JF's response told me very clearly that I am on the right track. He doesn't want to be on that track. He doesn't want us discussing that track. He was very, very focused on avoiding it altogether and trying to convince everyone not to even look at fixation. Remember, he was saying, don't talk about fixation. Don't look at fixation. The Royal Society says it is one of the cornerstones of population genetics. Unmarked X says parallel random mutation leading to speciation is even more unlikely than what you hypothesized. Well, I think that's probably true. Watchman says, I thought you were professional and even merciful with him. It was difficult to watch, just like the other debate. I felt bad for him. Well, I mean, I would have felt bad for him, except for the fact that, he decided to play that rhetorical game. I mean, now, the minute that I saw that he was retreating to rhetoric, I realized that I had won the whole thing. Ganji Bob Flanka said, disappointment on your face was for JF, not the model. Well, yeah, I was disappointed that he went down. Johnny Feather said, build your case, then debate JF. You both agreed last night it wasn't going to be a debate. It helped you to build your case only. Well, right, but the point is that he tried to go to rhetoric to dismiss it repeatedly. And I don't think that was right. I don't do that sort of thing. And I don't think it's intellectually appropriate. I don't think it's indicative of intellectual integrity. Anaf Habib says the parallel side brings up bigger problems for tens. You have to argue that the laws of physics in a bottom-up fashion behave in an orderly fashion to the point of being akin to fine-tuning. Possibly. I don't know. Ralph said, I don't know enough about the subject, but I thought JF was condescending and you were far more gentlemanly. Well, I don't care about that. I mean, it's his turf. It's his area. You know, but I do think that the condescending business was an act. I think that and the thing is, you have to keep in mind, it worked. He managed to convince the larger part of his audience, and he actually managed to convince a small portion of my audience that I had been blown out of the water through nothing more than hand waving, some rhetorical stunts, and missing the point, avoiding the point. You know, now that's fine. Remember, persuasion is about rhetoric. He was trying to persuade. And he did successfully persuade. I was not trying to persuade anyone. I'm not really trying to persuade you guys now because I don't have yet what I believe to be a absolutely conclusive case. Why? I repeat, there is no actual evidence yet, but it is coming very, very quickly and very, very soon. Temet Nashe says, what missing pieces do you need which we can help dig up in regards to your case? What I need to find is more studies like the one that show how many genes get fixed over a specific number of generations over time. So for example, that study where they show that 25 genes got fixed over 40,000 generations in parallel, that sort of thing is very, very interesting. Like basically how fast a gene can propagate through the entire species. All right. We're not talking about mutation rates. All mutation rates do is indicate that lots of mutations are possible. You know, the false assumption that JF and all the other biologists are making because they are not very good at math. And it's not about being good at math. I'm not particularly good at math. It's about having a sense for what the math means. It's about understanding the significance of the numbers involved. Cinnamon Bear says, Vox, what are your thoughts on dyslexia from an evolutionary perspective? I think it's totally irrelevant. I think it has nothing to do with it. Unless humanity is evolving at a really, really rapid rate, I don't see how it can be relevant. Dr. Christopher Hallpike makes some really good points about that, about how some of the things that we talk about having evolutionary impact can't actually have any evolutionary impact because the necessary genes were developed long before they were relevant. Frank Underwood says, could evolution have happened in cycles where environmental pressures kill off part of the population without a certain mutation, thus fixing the genes? Probably not, because the studies that they have done show that when a population is in decline, it actually makes it harder for beneficial mutations to survive. So beneficial mutations are actually more common when the population is growing. So this whole idea of environmental pressures and killing off the populations and the population bottlenecks and so forth don't really help. See, here's a good example of the stupidity of JF's followers. LOL. Vox get irredeemably BTFO about something he admits he knows nothing about and has no facts to support, yet sits here post facto saying, I totally nailed it, boys, LOL. You don't understand. I wasn't the one who failed to grasp something. JF didn't understand that the very parallelism that he was appealing to was already baked into the model. Now, admittedly, I didn't point that out, but I shouldn't have to point that out to somebody in his own area. Not only that, but he was forced to wave around irrelevant charts and make a big deal about a little program that doesn't have anything to do with what we're talking about. Remember, he didn't want to talk about fixation. But you have to talk about fixation if you're talking about evolution of the species, because without fixation, without a set of specific genes that only relate to one species and relates to all the species versus all the other species, you have neither species nor evolution. So, you simply don't understand I am literally too intelligent for you to understand. I might as well be sitting here speaking Chinese at you because your perception of reality is the complete opposite of what the actual case is. So it's, let's see. I wouldn't go... Okay, I'm going to delete this guy. Fuck, you sound... See, you got to love these gammas. They always try to make you act as if, oh, you're just butthurt. I'm not butthurt at all. I'm entirely satisfied with how it went. I'm just a little bit disappointed that JF went in the direction that he did. You know, it wasn't necessary. It's not going to serve him well in the future. Let's see. If you prove evolution wrong, it will destroy the left, destroy globalism. The last thing they want is people believing in God. Maybe, maybe not. Gavin says, never stop telling people they are too dumb to get what you're saying. That's true. Yeah, gammas always project. You know, they're always upset about something. They're always butthurt about something. And so they're constantly trying to project that onto you. How does the parallel effect not affect them scales? Well, again, I don't think that the parallelism is going to do any good because, you know, here on the one hand, JF was talking about how he could imagine that a gene would fixate in a population in 3 generations. Boom, instantly. I don't think so. And especially when we need more of this data, but the experimental data so far indicates that it takes a long time. It takes 1,600 generations for a gene to fixate in a population. And that was in parallel. That was happening at the same time. So now what we don't know, again, of course, these are very simple organisms. Is it possible that humans are propagating genes in parallel at a much higher rate because they're more complex? I mean, theoretically, it might be possible, but it's not very likely as best I understand it. Anaf Habib says, the parallel stuff is irrelevant. TENS is not saved by it because said stuff says nothing about the discrepancy in the real world we find every day of being unable to verify, falsify the mutation stuff. Right, but we're getting much closer because with the genetics, um, with the improvement in recording the genomes and stuff, they're already blowing out the old models, and this will get blown out too. Somebody said, made a comparison to, or talked about, he said, watch Dyer versus JF to see JF crumble under pressure. Well, I know, I was familiar with that. I mean, do you not think that I couldn't have used his quotes in the debate with Jay Dyer and compared them to the contradictory quotes from his book if I wanted to score rhetorical points at his expense? I have no need. Here's the thing. I have destroyed virtually every person I've engaged in a debate with, either dialectically or rhetorically. I can do that. You know what happens after you do that? Nobody cares at all. And the fans of the person that you just brutalized will simply lie about what happened. And they will run around saying the exact opposite. So I don't bother with that sort of thing anymore. The only kind of debate I'm interested in is a dialectical debate where we're actually trying to see whose ideas are better. That's why I really enjoyed the free trade debate with James Miller. That's why I really enjoyed the inflation deflation debate with Nate from the blog. I was hoping that the evolution debate with Jeff could go that way, and at first it seemed like it was, but then it became very clear that Jeff was just retreating to the usual rhetoric. Now, that's his choice, but I don't think it's going to serve him well in the future, because I think that a number of the things that he said in the debate last night are going to come back to haunt him. I always play a longer game. I never put all my cards on the table, especially for something as ridiculous as a little online debate. So, M. Cephas says the Bob Murphy debate was good. I don't think so. I thought the Bob Murphy debate was terrible because all Bob did was resort to orthodox economics and express incredulity. He never, ever even began to address the labor mobility issue. Ralph Cramna says, any debate, 90% of each person's fans will swear their guy won, no matter the content. That's probably true. Let's see. One of the things that's going to be interesting, and I'll put it up there, is one of my guys is, I believe, doing a transcript of the debate. And perhaps I'll put that into a little booklet. I've already got JF's permission to publish it. So I'll put that into a little booklet and share some of my thoughts, and we'll publish it, an ebook of it. And, you'll see very, very clearly there how irrelevant the rhetoric is. It's totally irrelevant. Does it allow you to, look like to persuade some people that you're a smart boy for a short period of time? Okay. Who cares? I don't care about that. I don't need some gammas. Dubson said, why were you nice on the stream, but now you're crying how you secretly won? You got humiliated and buried. You're not understanding the issue at all either. How was I buried? Because he ran away from the fixation issue, which is the cornerstone of population genetics, and kept talking about lots and lots of mutations. I mean, he was doing the equivalent of Carl Sagan's millions and millions of stars means that life must exist. That amounts to his argument. Millions and billions of mutations means we must have had time to mutate from the, whatever it was, the microdontids to humans in 200 million years. It doesn't matter how many mutations there are. The relevant mutations have to have the time to propagate through the entire species each time. Each species needs that. As for why I was nice on the stream, I'm always polite when I appear on someone else's channel. I didn't know what his response was going to be. Initially, everything was pretty straightforward, except for when he kept trying to steer the direction away from fixation. But fixation is the cornerstone of population genetics. So ask yourself this question. Why was he trying to steer the conversation away from the cornerstone of population genetics in order to talk about something that was not relevant to the subject at hand? Doesn't even make any sense. I wouldn't go that far. Ralph Cramden says, I was disappointed that JF went with the rhetoric when you were setting such a cordial tone. I found it disrespectful. I don't think he had a choice. If he didn't want to just admit the issue. Nunya Biz says, I think his argument is that one of those parallel threads do go that fast. But he was quibbling with the example I gave him that was a parallel example. All right? When the actual parallel example is 1600, you can't say, well, we can imagine that parallel could go 3. It doesn't make any sense. It's ridiculous. Let's see. You have Teflon in your bloodstream. You have to keep in mind that I was a nationally syndicated columnist back in 2001. Okay. I'm used to getting a tremendous amount of heat from people that really, really dislike what I'm saying. This kind of stuff is nothing. It's really not a problem at all. I want to make sure I didn't miss any super chats here. I think I did miss a few. Okay. Hi, Vox. Why isn't the fact that there are no chimpanzees with human genes not enough to destroy evolution? Well, because they believe that the separation between the two branches was 9 million years ago. And so, chimpanzees do have human genes. Apparently the overlap is 98%. But the devil in the details and the problem for evolution is in that 2%, because that 2% is a very large number and there's not enough time to explain that difference. Spearman asks, what is your take on the creation of mankind insofar as different races on different continents? My bad if you've already addressed this. Wonder about any validity of Genesis story, Adam and Eve. I honestly don't worry much about it. I personally think that Adam and Eve don't represent the creation of a brand new creature. I think they represent the bestowment of soul on creatures that already existed. Frank Underwood says, but it is not by killing off the non-mutated bacteria how we create antibiotic-resistant strains. Yes, that's correct. I don't understand that issue. Joseph Goebel says, don't worry, Vox, you don't need to debate with JF because he doesn't match your height in physical and mental form. He's a self-centered fat midget tard. I don't think that's fair to JF. He may be a bit self-centered, but he's not retarded. He's very smart. He's very well educated. Could evolution happen in cycles where the environmental... Okay, we already addressed that. Okay, I think, yeah, we're caught up on all the... Oh, and Drew M points out that JF never gave an alternative metric to fixation. Well, it's worse than that. He actually claimed that species don't exist. So, you don't need to worry about fixation if you just eliminate the species altogether. So, Vox, they can test fixation with mice if they wanted to, right? But I think they don't want to kill their baby. Well, they should be able to. If you think about how fast evolution has to have worked, and you think about how quickly mice generations propagate, then it shouldn't be that difficult to demonstrate that kind of speciation. or that kind of first fixation, and then even speciation, but they can't. Let's see here. Nunyabiz doesn't understand how this works, I think. But you both agreed on there being a speciation spectrum, because there is a speciation spectrum. But there's not a gradient like he described. There is a spectrum, but there's a human spectrum and there's a chimpanzee spectrum. There is not a gradient that goes all the way from the human spectrum to the chimpanzee spectrum. And that's what he was describing. Look for a book, The Elimination of a Species. And just to be clear, I liked JF's books. I liked his book, The Revolutionary Phenotype. I'm not, I don't have any massive problem with the guy. I was just disappointed that he was more concerned about maintaining his standing with his community than he was in seriously addressing the question. Satellite Jack says he just watched the debate. Very insightful. Seems like JF was insisting on the possibility ceiling instead of embracing a probability range. Is this my misinterpretation? No, that's exactly what he was doing. But that's very typical. That's what biologists do, because they don't understand the significance of the numbers. They just think that they can wave their hands and saying, oh, millions and billions, that gives us plenty of room. Well, no, it doesn't. Because if you actually run the numbers, or if you even just have a sense for the numbers, you know it's not enough. Because I'm an economist, we deal with trillions of dollars. We deal with billions and billions of interactions. Now, obviously, the ability of economists to understand and correctly quantify the economy and all that sort of thing is very, very limited. And as a pseudoscience, its performance is pretty pitiful. For example, you may not realize it, but economists have actually massaged the 2001 recession out of existence. That's ridiculous. I actually have a chapter in my book, Return of the Great Depression, which is called No One Knows Anything. And what I do is I point out that all of the official numbers over a series of time has a larger margin of error than the difference between growth and recession. I don't know if you understand the significance of that, but the point is that dealing with these levels of complexity and these very large numbers is something that economists do on a regular basis. And so when we see these very large numbers, like, oh, well, there's billions and billions of mutations, we just look at that and we instinctively understand, so what? Just because there's lots and lots of mutations doesn't help you get the one mutation through the entire population. In fact, you could even argue that it would be a problem. Let's see. Why is Vox scared to talk about vaccinations? I'm not. I'm not interested in talking about vaccinations. We're talking about evolution. Stay on subject. Let's see. I have no idea what some of you guys are talking about. Anyhow, let's see here. JF was chasing a black swan probability. He was saying there's a chance. Well, technically, sure. But again, those of us who think in terms of probability, it's not just that there had to be a black swan. There had to be a whole flock of black swans repeatedly over and over and over again. And that's why I'm increasingly confident in this basic concept of eventually demonstrating the statistical and mathematical impossibility of evolution, period. Not just by natural selection. Remember, they're already retreating hard from the theory of evolution by natural selection. There are already biologists who are saying that most evolution is through genetic drift. So the basic concept at the highest levels is already very, very questionable. And so the more that we learn about genetic science, the more that we learn about genetics, the more it is going to become obvious that the neo-Darwinian synthesis is also wrong. We will see, but there is a yeah, I don't know. Right-wing Rage said that JF had to shut it down after he threw up his smoke screen. I mean, yeah, there are some people who said that they thought that he was basically throwing up squid ink and retreating. I don't know. I mean, the guy was not well, so I'm hesitant to buy into that. And frankly, it's not really relevant. For me, all that mattered was that he was afraid to address the cornerstone of population genetics. He wanted to focus on something that was totally irrelevant to the topic at hand. And at the end, he retreated to rhetoric. Now, if you think that is blowing someone out, you're clearly limited to the rhetoric. You're not a dialectical thinker, and frankly, you're not smart enough to be watching this channel. But, I mean, you're certainly welcome to, but there's not really any point. I might as well be speaking Chinese as far as you're concerned. Let me see. There was one other thing I wanted to point out before I go. Oh, that's right. On a totally unrelated matter, we have a new comic out today. This is a screenshot from the store. Quantum Mortis number 4. Quantum Mortis, A Man Disrupted number 4 is now out. You can see the cover is on the... okay, I'm going to delete this idiot. Who is this moron? Hash something. Look, here's a little lesson for you guys. Trying to get me to do things by saying that I am scared is going to get you banned every single time. I talk about what I want to talk about. I don't talk about what you want me to talk about. And I don't not talk about what you want me to talk about because I'm scared. So hash God, you are banned. So, anyhow, back to the point. Quantum Mortis, this is the comic that is based on my science fiction novel published about 10 years ago or so. And it's, if I say so myself, I think it's a pretty good story. You can pick it up at arkhavencomics.com. Each 24-page issue is $2.99, and it comes both in Kindle format as well as high-resolution CBZ format. So it's good stuff. If you're interested in supporting the stream, that's one way you can do it. And I look forward to seeing you all the next time. This has been my thoughts on yesterday's evolution debate. You can watch it over at the public space. I'm Vox Day. This is the Darkstream.